All right, so here we go. We are live on YouTube. So hi to everybody and welcome to our webinar this evening called A Voice for Global Citizens Roadmap Towards a World Citizens Initiative. And before we get started, I just need to explain a little bit how this discussion will work. So as you've seen, this is a Zoom meeting and not a broadcast or a webinar, which means that we really see this as a discussion and not a lecture. We will have a short introduction followed by a presentation from our speakers. And afterwards, we will open the floor for questions. So you will have a possibility to ask everything you want. For now, all participants are automatically muted so that we don't have too many background noises, and we ask you to keep it that way during the speaker inputs or while other people are talking, but you can unmute yourself to ask a question afterwards. If you want to ask a question, you can use the chat or raise your hand. There's an option for that in the participants window somewhere on your toolbar. And for those of you who are following along on YouTube, it is possible to ask your questions there as well. Someone from our team is following there and will make sure that we get the questions here. So for now, we are very, very happy to see how many people signed in to join us for this webinar. Our Zoom room is almost full. And we wanted to get started just with a little bit of background. So from Democracy International, together with Democracy Without Borders and Civicus, a little over a year ago, we actually launched the We the People's campaign. And we really see it as part of a bigger civil society push for a more inclusive and democratic global governance. In this global interconnected world that we live in, we see that we are increasingly confronted with challenges that are too big for single states to find solutions to. We can only do something about climate change or about mass extinction if we all work together, for example. And I think especially in the last year, as we are going through a global public health crisis that I'm sure each and every one of you is affected by, I think we've all felt how important international multilateral cooperation really is. And of course, the UN, the United Nations, is the prime arena for that. But at the same time, what we also see is that what is important to states is not necessarily what's important to citizens, and vice versa. So the issues that matter to citizens don't always make it onto the global stage where they can be addressed. And this disconnect between global governance at the UN, but they're certainly not the only ones where this is an issue. The same goes for different institutions, but this disconnect between them and the people they represent is really the issue that we wanted to look at. And so last year in 2020, we actually, I don't know if many of you know this, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And we saw this as the opportunity to put this disconnect on the agenda and to suggest what we think would be a possible solution for this, or one tool in a toolbox, a citizens initiative for the UN. And so in a little over a year, we managed to build a really broad civil society coalition with over 300 or around 300 organizations from around the world. And I think this really shows that it's an instrument that speaks to people's imagination. I think that's also why so many people have joined tonight. And it also has to be said, really, that the UN themselves took the 75th anniversary as an opportunity to take stock not only of what has been accomplished in these decades, but also to see what citizens and what real people around the world really expect from the UN. So in 2020, they carried out a series of consultations, debates, surveys that reached in total over 1.5 million citizens in all UN member states to collect inputs. And they've collected all of this in a report that they published last month, the UN 75 report, and we will post a link to that in the chat. And so what became clear from all of these discussions that they've had and all of these inputs is that most people, 97% of people, think that international cooperation is something that is really important and something that we need to address the issues that we face today. But also, a majority of people feel like the UN is far from their lives. And so there really is a need to make this UN more democratic and more inclusive. And the interesting thing is that the report also identifies ways to do that. And I mean, one way, for example, would be to reform the Security Council. This is something that we've heard a lot. But one thing that they've also so that the UN includes in their own report, looking to the future of the UN, is a possibility of introducing a citizens' initiative right or a consultation tool at the General Assembly, which is of course exactly what we've been calling for. And so, given that there's this really great momentum at the moment, we wanted to take this opportunity to have a closer look at what such an instrument could look like, how it would work, if it's feasible. And so, yeah, so that's really what we want to do tonight. And before we really dive into that, I would briefly like to give the floor to my colleague Daniela Vansink, who's our European Program Manager at Democracy International, and who can tell us a little bit why a UN World Citizens Initiative is actually not a crazy idea at all. So Daniela, if you're there, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Caroline, and hi everyone. Good evening or good day, depending where you're tuning in from. So as you probably know, the World Citizens Initiative is directly inspired from a tool that already exists, and that's the European Citizens Initiative. If you're based in the EU, I hope you know a little bit about it, but we'll hear a lot more from our experts about just how much the structure of the World Citizens Initiative could resemble the European Citizens Initiative. But just to put this all into perspective, it's really not just the tool that of the World Citizens Initiative that's inspired by the ECI. It's the campaign itself too. The Campaign for a World Citizens Initiative is really inspired by the civil society campaigns that brought us the European Citizens Initiative that we have now today. So a little bit of a history lesson for you all. Back 20 years ago, when the European Citizens Initiative was just an idea, just a campaign, it was pushed and supported by democracy activists and civil society. And it was actually those very founding members of Democracy International 20 years ago, before we were even an officially registered association, that were lobbying for the introduction of what we know today as the European Citizens Initiative in the current treaty of the EU. So with that, I just want to say that we've been here before. We've done this before. We have this experience, and as civil society, we've pushed ideas that may have sounded too good to be true at the time, but in the end, with strong and organized civil society support, an idea can really become a reality. So there is this potential of power in this idea that we're discussing today, a World Citizens Initiative, and we're already off to a really great start, as Caroline mentioned, with in just our first year, over 300 NGOs joining the Alliance already. So it may just be one day that in the future we'll realize these were the times that were helping shape that history. Maybe starting with this this webinar, you're part of history right here. But we hope it won't take 10 or 20 years this time to make the idea come to life. We have a lot of lessons learned from the years campaigning for a European Citizens Initiative, so we know a little bit about what to expect. But without taking up more of your time, yeah, I would really look forward then to an interesting webinar and to hearing from our experts and to hearing from your questions. So thanks again for your interest in this idea.
Yeah, and then so thanks, Daniela. Yeah, so the first thing we did when we came up with this idea is we looked for two experts who could really help us create a blueprint of this instrument. And so we were very lucky to have the assistance and the help of Dr. James Organ and Dr. Ben Murphy of the University of Liverpool, who are here with us today. And they've really written this whole plan of how this could work, how we can get there, down in a really great study, which we will also publish in the chat, which is available for download on our website. And so Dr. James Organ is an expert on the European Citizens Initiative, and Dr. Ben Murphy is an expert on international law. And so together they make really a great team to talk about citizen participation at the UN. So I would give the both of you the floor now. I'm not sure who wants to kick off, and yeah, so yes, please welcome Dr. James Organ and Dr. Ben Murphy.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and thanks to the organisers of the webinar. Can you hear me okay? Just checking. Fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting us to reflect on the potential legal feasibility of establishing and implementing a mechanism such as a citizens' initiative at the UN level. It's a great time to embark upon such a reflection just over a year after the launch of the campaign, and as the campaign continues to move on at such fantastic pace. As Caroline said, James and I come to this question from slightly different perspectives. Among many other things, James is an expert on the European Citizens Initiative and citizen participation at the European Union level. I am predominantly an international lawyer, and I hope to bring some insights into the institutional dynamics that might be at play in implementing a World Citizens Initiative. James and I have used this distinction in allocating our responsibilities this evening. Essentially, I will speak to the why and the how of establishing a World Citizens Initiative, the context, we might say. And James will speak more specifically to the what. What is a World Citizens Initiative, drawing on his European Citizens Initiative experience. How can it be implemented, and what challenges might it face? For those of us who are in a rush, though, the headline is this. Notwithstanding the obvious legal and political challenges that an initiative like this might face, we do not conclude that these challenges are insurmountable. So to the context, the democratic deficit that a World Citizens Initiative would respond to speaks directly to the issue that attracted me most to this project. International organizations like the UN are sometimes described as Frankenstein monsters. These monsters are created by states, but they take on a life of their own. The Frankenstein metaphor works to an extent because these same creator states sometimes struggle to keep hold of the organization. But the Frankenstein metaphor misses an important point. And that is that the new life that international organizations take on have a particular impact on individual citizens. Think only of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council's counter-terrorist sanctions regime, whereby the Security Council decides to place an individual on a terrorist sanctions list. The Security Council can freeze your assets, seize property, impose a travel ban. But neither me or you as individuals, or even our host state on behalf of us, has any real capacity to petition the Security Council to give reasons for why we might be on such a list, or even to remove the ban. Now, the UN also has the capacity to wield power in really positive ways and to contribute towards human progress. Think only of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a landmark moment in international human rights protection. Think only of the UN Sustainability Development Goals. But the common denominator here is key. Whether impacting upon individual lives in a negative or a positive sense, it doesn't cut both ways. The same individuals very rarely have any direct input into international organizational decision-making practices. In some ways, this is the only way that it could traditionally have been. International law is the law that's made by states, about states. International organizations are traditionally seen to be intergovernmental in nature. However, in an era when more direct forms of democracy are gaining influence in a range of different contexts, it's becoming increasingly clear that the idea that the UN operates through a veiled form of representative democracy, i.e. our governments represent us and act on our behalf, doesn't seem to ring true. This paradox was captured very well by the expert report on the UN's relations to civil society, the Cardoso report, which outlined the deficits of democracy in global governance and noted that one of the key principles of democracy is connecting citizens to the decisions that affect them and ensuring public accountability for those decisions. Importantly, the Cardoso report specifically emphasized the potential role of the United Nations in this regard, arguing that it should be the center of any efforts to reshape democracy to make it more relevant to individual citizens. To do this, however, as then Secretary General Kofi Annan observed in his Millennium Report, he said the UN must be opened up further to the participation of many actors whose contributions are essential to managing the path of globalization. This idea of opening up the United Nations has given rise to a number of different projects, not least the idea of a World Parliamentary Assembly as a citizens elected global representative institution, and participation as a means of democratizing global governance in, for example, a global citizens assembly. The idea of a World Citizens Initiative should be seen as an additional mechanism to complement, not compete against, these existing processes and projects. I'll very quickly say a few words about the potential challenges that such an initiative may come up against. The first two are simply challenges that speak to issues of feasibility or effectiveness. We might look to a challenge of the capacity of individuals, right? How much influence can individual citizens really wield? But of course, this problem is not unique to the United Nations, but it's unique to any initiative that speaks to participatory direct democracy. The second challenge, though, would be one of scale. With a global constituency of some 7.8 billion people, it might be difficult for citizens to directly influence policy agendas at the UN level. But I think really important lessons can be learned here for how the European Citizens Initiative overcame these challenges. The third challenge would be the nature of international law, right? Individuals are traditionally seen in international law as objects upon whom to bestow rights and obligations. And this would need to change from individuals as just having rights and obligations to individuals being genuinely power holders that can influence the agenda of the United Nations. That said, this idea of individuals influencing power is deeply embedded in international legal doctrine, not least Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The logical legal consequence of Article 25, the citizens' right to political participation, is that individuals should be upgraded from mere passive international legal subjects, i.e. individuals that just have rights and obligations, to active individual international legal subjects. The fourth challenge might be the intergovernmental nature of the United Nations. But I think what's lost here when we think of the UN as simply being a forum of states is the very first three words of the UN Charter itself: we the peoples. It seems that at this stage, the idea of citizen participation at the UN starts and ends with those three words in the UN Charter. And a key theme underpinning the idea of a World Citizens Initiative would be to give some real meaning and substance to this we the peoples idea underpinning the UN Charter. Now, James will speak to the various specific stages that a World Citizens Initiative process might take. I will finish then by zooming in on one particular organ of the UN, the UN General Assembly, that I think could be the most appropriate organ for the World Citizens Initiative to seek to influence. But that doesn't sort of close the door to influencing the UN Security Council should the particular issue at stake trigger the Council's responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. If the underlying rationale is to influence the political agenda and to encourage states to support a particular proposal, The General Assembly might possibly be the most appropriate forum to discuss a WCI proposal, because the scope of the General Assembly's power is not limited in any way. The General Assembly may discuss any matter under the competence of the UN. It has the power to pass resolutions that member states are expected to respond to, but these resolutions are not legally binding. However, the General Assembly is in a position to launch intergovernmental negotiations under the auspices of the UN on new treaties, or to put questions in front of the International Law Commission for further consideration. There are 4 ways that a WCI proposal might influence the General Assembly's agenda. And I'll conclude by briefly going through what these 4 ways might be. The first way might be for a World Citizens Initiative proposal to be added to the agenda to be discussed at the initial general debate of each annual session, while heads of state and government are present at the General Assembly. This would certainly enhance publicity, but would require the organising committee to meet the required timescales and to comply with the procedures of the UN General Committee. The second option would be for a World Citizens Initiative to trigger a special session of the General Assembly. It may be, thirdly, that instead of a plenary debate, it would be preferable for the WCI proposal to be discussed in one of the 6 main committees that cover individual substantive issues within the General Assembly. Finally, and with the most impact, and there's no reason at this stage why we shouldn't be as ambitious as possible, a WCI could potentially oblige the UN, either the General Assembly or the Security Council, to draft a particular resolution in response to a proposal and then vote on that resolution. Whilst we can't expect individual member states to accept an obligation to vote in favour of that resolution, at the very least, a WCI might impose an obligation for that same state to give reasons, an obligation that states do not currently have. At this stage, I'll pass over to James, who'll talk about more of the specifics.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. Risk of going second is, of course, Ben's taken some of my time, but that's. I'm also conscious that there's lots of people here today, and I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I won't speak for too long. Thanks for the overview, Ben, from the UN perspective. As Caroline says, our expertise approach these issues from slightly different directions, but there obviously is overlap. Ben's covered a couple of things that I'll come on to later, such as impacts. But what I'll try to do in the few minutes I've got is just to put some flesh on the bones, to give you a sense of the design that a WCI might have, the sort of regulations it might have, and how that links back to the European Citizens Initiative, the ECI, and the learning that we've got from the ECI over the years. As we've heard, as we probably agree, democracy is always evolving at every level, and of course the international level is no exception. Our argument is that the WCI, the World Citizens Initiative, is a feasible step towards developing the democratic legitimacy of UN decision making. As Caroline said, it's part of a toolbox. It's not a cure for all democratic ills. It's part of that gradual evolution of UN democracy, and hopefully will link into other instruments that come along in the future. Citizens' participation through a citizens' initiative, fundamentally that brings some of the core values of democracy to international decision making. Decision making that's currently based on through legitimacy through the member states. The European Citizens Initiative is the world's first supranational instrument of participatory democracy. There are lots of national citizens initiatives, but the ECI is the first supranational one, the first one linked to an international organisation, the EU. It's not directly transferable to the UN.
James, I'm so sorry to cut in, but there seems to be a little bit of an issue with your microphone. I don't know if you can...
Oh, can I put it? Is that better?
Much better, thank you.
That's much closer, sorry. You've only missed the preamble, so so all I was saying was the ECI is not directly transferable to the UN level, but there is plenty of learning that we can glean from it. And our proposal is that the WCI follows. Can you hear me better? Is that all right now? So it does follow the sort of agenda setting initiative that we've that the ECI has. In other words, the ECI gives citizens a formal opportunity to make a policy or legislative proposal, and that when they reach an agreed level of support, there's an obligation on a political body to respond. Broadly speaking, that's the definition of a citizens' initiative. And the ECI is an agenda setting initiative, as the WCI will be, means that there's no definite obligation imposed on that political body. A lot of it is about influence and influencing the agenda rather than a direct impact on at the decision-making stage. So the hope was that the ECI would bring a whole new dimension of participatory democracy to the EU. There is the potential for the WCI to do the same for the UN, but those high expectations, we should temper them a little bit. There are challenges, which I'll speak to in the next couple of minutes, but there have been successes. We've had 6 successful ECIs that have reached the million signatories needed from a sufficient number of member states. We've had 10 million people sign ECIs, 76 proposals have been made and registered, and all sorts of subjects have been covered, from the right to water, animal welfare, citizens' rights, vaping, marriage, road speeds, and many, many more. So there is the desire there from citizens to support these proposals. There's a desire there from people to organise them as well. The 3 stages, generally speaking, for organising an initiative is setting up the committee, registering the proposal. Secondly, collecting support. And thirdly, submitting your proposal and getting a response from the relevant body. I'll quickly go through each of them. I'll pick out 1 or 2 things from each of those steps in the process. First, setting up the committee. This committee leads and is responsible for the campaign, maintains communication with the authorities, an essential part of smooth progress of a citizens' initiative. An important point is that it should reflect the polity that the proposal is being made to. So a WCI committee should reflect its global reach. An ECI has 7 representatives from member states. The World Citizens Initiative, we suggested 10 representatives from an equitable geographical distribution, the one set out in Article 23(1) of the Charter. That distribution is 5 African or Asian states, 1 Eastern European state, 2 Latin American states, and 2 Western European and other states. How exactly that's decided is obviously a question for the UN, but that was our proposal, a kind of starting position, starting discussion point. Topics, the subject matter can be fairly broad for the reasons that Ben stated. Registration has been a challenge at the EU level, but has largely been worked through. There have been several court cases challenging the Commission's application of registration criteria, largely worked through. I think that's something that the UN can hopefully avoid. Registration is an important legal step that gives citizens' initiatives their official status, elevates it beyond something like the status of a petition. But I think for the WCI, I don't envisage any problems in establishing that point. One key question, though, that I wanted to raise was whether a WCI should be able to advance reform, significant reform proposals or charter changes. How fundamental should citizens be? What level of fundamental change should citizens be able to propose? I'm
so sorry, James. You have to. I actually think it's probably better if you make it a bit further away from.
Okay. I don't normally have this problem. I hope it's not something broken. Is that better?
It is better. Yeah. Thank you. Apologies.
No, that's my technology.
Exactly.
Do stop me if it gets worse again. Secondly, collecting support for the citizen initiative proposals. Lots of administrative hurdles here. identifying how you identify someone as a signatory, electronic systems, verification of signatories, length of collection time, and so on. I'm happy to go into detail in questions. Given the limited time, I'll just focus on one key question that Ben also alluded to, and that's the level of support you need for an initiative to be a success. This is a fundamental question for the legitimacy of these processes. Deciding the support threshold is complicated. There's several factors that need to be worked through, but in general, the higher the level of support required, the more legitimate it is for a citizens' initiative, for a WCI proposal to have an impact on decision making. So the more people you have signed for support, the more pressure there is on the political receiving authority to make a change. If set too low, the legitimacy will be limited. You'll only have a very small percentage of citizens from supporting something, and it reduces the chance that unwilling political actors will respond in the way the campaigners hope, even if you have met the threshold set. One of the other factors, which then complicates matters, is that the higher the threshold you set, the higher you set for legitimacy, the more difficult, for example, it will be to collect support. So you then have the other trade-off against the practicality of these initiatives. If you set the support level at tens of millions of citizens globally, it's going to be very hard for campaigners to reach that level and have any impact at all, and it could fall into disuse. The EU seems to have set the levels reasonably well. About 0.2% of the EU population, 1 million citizens from 7 member states. We tried to set a slightly similar sort of approach, a fairly low total population, but try and have some geographic spread. We tried to set that for the WCI as well. So 5 million citizens is our suggestion, from the same spread as the organising committee: 5 African Asian states, Eastern European states, 2 Latin American, 2 Western European states, and we set a core at level at which they 0.5% of the population of that state's population to be adding to that number. So we hope that strikes the balance between direct citizens' legitimacy through a total number of citizen support and legitimacy from a sufficient number of member states. So reflects the member state legitimacy of the UN. I'm running out of time. I won't say too much about impact, but impact is fundamental to this, and it's still this is probably the biggest ongoing issue for the ECI, is expectation from campaigners about impact. Obviously, you've gone through a lot of effort to get a proposal on the table, to get the support for it. There's expectations there. On the other hand, there's the necessity for what is actually a relatively small percentage of the population, perhaps, to feed into the policy making and decision making processes. So there are expectations from the policy makers' side that they should be able to bring other concerns to bear. As Ben said, we did put a proposal in for how a WCI can impact on United Nations decision making. So I won't say any more about that. In conclusion, the exact design of the WCI will depend on answering those sort of key questions that I've covered, but there are several more. The 3 that I picked out were what subjects are appropriate for a proposal, who does that proposal go to, the support level we need, and what impact do we expect. My final point really is that we feel this is legally feasible to have a WCI. It will have, or certainly has the potential to have an influence on the democratic legitimacy of the UN, but of course that's if the political will is there to use the WCI to develop citizen participation. And I'll end there. Apologies, Caroline, for the poor technology, and I hope I haven't gone too far over time.
That's fine, no worries. We could hear you. There was just a little bit of background noise or something in the meantime, but I think we understood quite well, and we have some time still for questions. So as I mentioned before, we really see this as a discussion, and so this is also the reason that we plan this as a meeting and not as a webinar or a broadcast. Is that we also like to hear from you, the people who've joined us, and I see a lot of people were already writing in the chat, people from all around the world, which is really nice. Some literary tips as well. But I would really now open the floor for questions. So if any of you have a question, feel free to maybe raise your hand. Easiest for me is if you use the Zoom function for that, and then we will give you the floor. And so we have one question already. Please, I hope I say this right. Uffe, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, hello. And thank you for the this very nice event. I'm looking forward to take part of this dialogue. I am a board member of the United Nations Association in Denmark, and I have been doing some citizen initiatives, like I have followed the conference on the future of Europe, but I couldn't wait for the EU to start this, so I started one myself, called a dialogue about the future of Europe. And I've just made a citizen think tank calling Europe Dialogue. But in this dialogue, I would like to focus on Europe and the world. And I've also created a friendship group, Africa-Europe. So I really appreciate this initiative, and I really look forward to take part of it. So thank you very much for this event.
Yeah, thank you very much. So no question, just compliments. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for joining. I think we have another question or comment from Matthew. Please go ahead.
Hi there. So great to be joining you from the English East Midlands. A wonderful talk. Just to say that I'm the founder of Lib Dem Friends of the SDGs. So really good to be with you today. My question is, this agenda sounds fantastic. I think it's really important, but aren't many Western democracies turning inwards? Aren't many Western democracies becoming nationalist rather than internationalist, albeit that the United States is looking out to the world again? But how does this agenda fit with that inward kind of navel gazing that is going on here in the UK and many other places?
Should we take
yes.
questions? Did you want to take questions one at a time, or?
Yes, I think one at a time is. We will see how far we get. So please go ahead, James, if you want to take that.
Yeah, just I mean, that's a big question, Matthew. Obviously, my response would be that I think this is a way of testing that question of international views, and that if we have the ECI, if we have the WCI, it gives citizens the opportunity to support these proposals and to say, yes, we are interested. We directly as citizens can make that statement on our own basis without necessarily the reliance on member states, governments, and so on, which, as you said, some are turning inward.
Thank you. I believe there was also a question from Colleen. Please go ahead and ask us your question.
Hello, everyone from Canada. I was thinking about the realization that you mentioned, Ben, about the gap between civil society and the best intentions of the UN. From a psychological base, one of the things I hear in all of the documents I read from the UN, and maybe the best intentions of things like Coalition for the UN We Need, UN 2020 or 2021, maybe it is now. The thing that I keep hearing that I'm thinking that our initiative would need to address right away is, what is the nature of the gap? If we just kind of plow ahead and say, well, I think it's this, I think it's that, it's just about connecting resources, services. In a way, there's already lots of that. What I hear more from people is it's the relationships that are not happening. It's the relationships that are not sustainable. It's the deep dive. It's what are the deep needs that come up in terrorist activity? For example, in ISIS, the need to belong, brotherhood, being able to shape a worldview. So I'm wondering if that might be a place to begin, like what is the nature of the gap? What are your thoughts? Before we get to...
Oh, it seems like I would like to ask anybody who's not speaking to mute themselves, while otherwise we have these sort of background sounds. Sorry, Colleen, I think you were just rounding up your thought there.
No, I think I was finished. That's often missed. We do needs assessments, we do assessments of many types, we do cultural assessments, but universally, and even in a World's Initiative, there is a universal need that any kind of program, proposal, policy must address. This would be the new shift to bring to a UN and show them how it's relevant and show them how it can be measured. Sorry, I'm done.
Thank you. James or Ben, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
I think it's a fascinating and really important question that Colleen raises, and I don't suggest that here and now I'll be able to answer such an important question as how can we capture the essence of the gap. It's one thing to say that citizens don't currently have the legal capacity to participate meaningfully at the UN. To go to that next level and say why is that the case, and how do we actually categorize and conceptualize the nature of this gap? I think it's an unbelievably important question, and the world will be a better place when we get closer to the answer. I guess my small contribution to that would be that initiatives like this create new spaces to have the types of conversations that Colleen wants to have, because the intergovernmental state-centric nature of the UN as it's currently constituted simply doesn't create a forum to even begin to answer the question that Colleen is asking. So that's really the only sort of tiny sort of contribution that I could make to such a big question. But I also think that thinking takes us back to Matthew's question as well. Where does this type of initiative sit in an increasingly sort of nationalistic world? Well, on the one hand, institutions like the UN simply have to continue to exist however inward-facing states want to be, because certain global problems will simply not be challenges will not be met without cooperation at the United Nations. But sometimes I also think that one problem doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek solutions in other ways. So while states are acting in increasingly nationalistic ways, initiatives like this actually provide opportunities to circumvent the state and allow citizens to have a direct influence. But I think Colleen's question is really well taken, and it's a question that we should all think more about, I think.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. I believe the next person who had a question is Javier. I'm trying my best to pronounce that right. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Hello from Madrid. Thank you very much for this wonderful meeting. It has been very interesting for me, and I hope for everyone also. I have maybe a general question, maybe it's mostly general to either Ben or James. And one of them is from a political perspective, and the other one would be more from the legal or institutional perspective. So my question is that given the current veto power in the UN Security Council, and given the fact that the UN Assembly hasn't yet a genuine legislative power unlike the European Parliament, I would like to ask these two questions. First of all, how would this veto power interfere the possible success of any future World Citizen Initiative regarding, for example, human rights or condemnation of military coups? I'm thinking in recent China veto over Myanmar coup condemnation in UN Security Council or any other issue. And my second question is more from a legal point of view. Given this fact that the UN Assembly has a genuine legislative power, what kind of tangible outcome would have a resolution in UN General Assembly in case of successful World Citizen Initiative? So would it be a mere recommendation, as some sort of a parliamentary motion, or a non-binding political statement? So this is my two questions. Thank you very much.
Go first, Ben.
I'll give it a go. Thank you so much. I think they're really, really important questions. We could potentially split the question into two. What challenge does the WTI face, considering the inherent veto power of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council? And if we therefore focus our attention on the General Assembly because of problem number 1, how do we overcome the non-binding nature of General Assembly resolutions? So considering the Security Council's veto, it will be important when thinking through the particular reform proposals that a WCI campaign makes, and to ensure that these reform proposals do not amount to suggestions that we should amend the UN Charter. Because not only do the permanent members of the Security Council have an inherent veto when it comes to decisions of the Security Council itself, the permanent members of the Security Council also have the veto capacity when it comes to reforming the UN Charter. However, as sort of James and I attempt to show in the report, there would indeed be ways to establish a mechanism such as this that would not amount to a formal amendment of the UN Charter. Just on this point, though, an issue that's often overlooked when it comes to the Security Council veto. It's not just when individual permanent members veto a particular decision because of their own political alliances. What you actually also find is that certain issues, and I might not go as far as to mention the particular issue, considering we're live on YouTube and the political sensitivity of the particular issue I'm thinking of, but these issues do not even get to the agenda of the Security Council. So there's a particular conflict that I have in my mind that would be absolutely the type of conflict that the Security Council would traditionally discuss that never even gets to the agenda of the Security Council because a particular permanent member would veto that. So a relatively modest proposal that the World Citizens Initiative might have would be to say that at the very least, a proposal should be discussed within the Security Council, albeit without imposing obligations that the Security Council might take action. To the second point, the non-binding nature of the General Assembly's power, that's absolutely correct. The General Assembly does not have the power to bind individual member states, but some declarations and resolutions of the General Assembly, non-binding as they may be, have become some of the more influential and long-standing resolutions in the history of the UN. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a non-binding sort of legal instrument of the General Assembly. And think of the influence that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has had on international human rights protection. And as a final point, the nature of international law tells us that whilst these decisions may be political statements, legally non-binding, they can actually have an unbelievable degree of influence. So I don't think that is the type of hurdle that it necessarily would be in other legal contexts. I think it's a really, really good question.
Thanks, Ben. I was just going to add, I mean, that goes to the heart of the debates at the moment about the European Citizens Initiative and how far it should be able to go as an instrument to enable groups of citizens to change policy and lawmaking in the EU. On the one hand, if a lot of citizens support an issue, there's an expectation that that initiates a legislative process or has a change on policy. But on the other hand, there may be things that are supported that by 1.5 million people out of the 500 odd million we have in Europe that are actually against the interests of the majority. So as we do in many democratic theoretical situations, we've got this debate between support from a formally approved minority and checking it against the majority legitimacy of people across a polity, and obviously on a global level that becomes even clearer. But as Ben said, that legal definition of how much impact it should have, and for the ECI, for those who aren't aware, the ECI only promises to its campaigners that the Commission will consider, so it will consider making a proposal. So the ECI is only an invitation to act. Nevertheless, it's had some influence. I think most campaigners say it hasn't had enough influence. Most commissioners say it's had a lot of influence. So we can see this kind of gap between expectations on either side, the bureaucracy or the politicians thinking we're responding to the people and listening, and the campaigners wanting more influence. And obviously somewhere in the middle, we can come to an agreement and we can make change. And as Ben was saying, it's that political influence. It's the political influence that's brought to bear on these issues. Often becomes more important than the actual legal definition of exactly how much impact they can have.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep checking this idea that we have to the reality of the existing tool that we have in Europe, and seeing that that it really does do things, even if it is an agenda-setting initiative. So it can really still move things. So I believe we have a question from Tad Daly, an Earthling in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Carolyn. I identify myself that way because where we are does not define who we are, right? So I am, yes, good morning to all from Los Angeles. Tad Daly, I guess I've been a policy advisor or speechwriter for 4 different members of the US Congress. Now I work with Citizens for Global Solutions, 74 years old this month. The venerable NGO. I see our executive director, Bob Flax, is with us. I would like to ask about a not dissimilar proposal. I think I know the answer to this question, but I just really want to clarify it. It's the idea that I know many of you are not unfamiliar with for creating a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. Andreas Bummel, who I see with us, has been the great guru and champion of this idea for many years. It is the idea that already elected national parliamentarians could sit at a new formally instituted body at the UN under Article 22. And I just want to clarify that these 2 proposals are not mutually exclusive, I hope. I hope it's not the case that this new World Citizens Initiative is somehow replacing our civil society advocacy. And I hope that I hope that those of us who are global governance innovation advocates can and should advance both the proposal for a UN Parliamentary Assembly and the World Citizens Initiative as 2 really complementary forces. Thanks.
Ben and James, you're very free to comment on this if you want, but I feel like this is also maybe a little bit of a question to us from the campaign, and so I will just briefly give an input here as well. So yes, we know and we support the proposal for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. As you know, Democracy Without Borders, who have called for that for a long time, is one of the steering committee members on this campaign. And actually, very shortly, we are planning to launch an endorsement statement or a call for a more inclusive, more democratic governance that combines both proposals, or that has both proposals, and that also calls for more civil society involvement. So for a UN civil society envoy. So these are absolutely complementary, and in our view, complementary proposals, and we should push for all of them. We don't have to compete with each other. Why should we? But James and Ben, if you want to, feel free to add something to that.
I was going to add something slightly not about civil society, slightly tangential, but civil society has been mentioned a few times by the question. Just say that this is termed as a World Citizens Initiative, but in reality, civil society is fundamental to this, and the space that Ben talked about earlier about that it creates is often occupied by civil society organisations. It's a debate. It's how best to manage and establish that process is a key discussion as well.
Yeah, we do say in the report that we see no reason at all why that an initiative such as this should be seen to be in competition with other existing projects. And if I sort of received a question like that in another webinar, I'd ring the brilliant Andreas, and considering we have him in the room, I wondered if you wanted to comment on the relationship that you see, Andreas, but obviously don't feel obliged.
Oh, am I supposed to respond to that?
I think
only if you want to.
Well, I can only repeat what Caroline already said, and thanks for this very good question. These two proposals and campaigns are really completely complementary, and I believe that they are not only complementary, but they also reinforce each other. And that's why I think it's really good, from my point of view, that we are trying to synergize the efforts, because it's the same goal coming from two different directions. One is participatory democracy connecting to citizens directly, and the other is representative democracy connecting with citizen elected representatives. So I think that in the future, we might connect these two things even more than we do now.
Yeah, I think a systemic approach to democracy is something that that would be my argument, is to always think about the system and the different aspects, the different instruments, the different opportunities we have as citizens to engage with policy making brings its own strengths. Each instrument brings its own strength to the democratic environment in which we live.
If this is okay with you, we're going slightly over time, but we have two more questions. I would suggest that if James and Ben, if you're with us for a little bit longer, that we can just take those questions. Great. I see Keith McNeil has his hand raised. So please go ahead and ask your question.
Keith McNeil, I live in Clearwater, British Columbia, Canada. And just speaking about implementing World Citizen Initiative, and just wondering, who do you see as being the decision makers on this? Who are the people that say, well, that sounds like a good idea, let's do it? And then how do we reach those people?
So I'm not sure that I know the answer. So the question was, how do we make this happen? I think, is that right, Keith? Who are the that feels more like a campaigning question to me. Ben, do you have a sense of I mean, my short answer would be the member states. So the UN is a member state organization. It's member states themselves that need to decide to make this happen. That's where the political will is going to come from. Unfortunately, it feels a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas, because they're agreeing to give away agreeing to give away a very tiny but a slither of their power. But as Daniela said right back at the beginning, we've been through this process with the ECI, so there's hope that we can persuade member states that this is beneficial, and this does we hope the member states see strengthening of democracy as beneficial to them and their citizens as well, and don't see it as taking away from their power. It should be building the session. I hope that was answered the question to some degree.
I would agree with James. I'd say, like with any sort of initiative or project like this, it's maybe engaging, civil society organizations and activists to build a momentum towards the key players here, which, as James, correctly acknowledges, would be individual member states. And then when we get to this sort of moment, I think the key theme needs to be to show member states that whilst it may seem to be, giving away a degree of member state sovereignty, the thing that really sort of attracts me to this proposal is that it is novel and innovative, but also modest to the same degree. And it's important to acknowledge that a World Citizens Initiative would not and could not oblige member states to act in any particular way or vote in any particular way. And it's about sort of explaining and selling that element of the proposal that I think would be so important. It's so novel, it's so innovative, but it's also modest in its own way. And I think it would be important for member states to understand that. But again, as James said, it's essentially a question to do with the campaign itself. So I don't know if you wanted to chip in from that perspective, Caroline or Daniela.
I could say, yeah, maybe just a quick, just to reiterate what has already been said, of course, we'll need member states from the one end, but we can't, I think we can't expect that politicians, and by politicians, I mean the top level administrations and governments and foreign ministers, even if they like this idea, they're not going to come out and say, okay, we will put in a World Citizens Initiative for the goodness of our heart. We're going to need on the other side civil society to put that push in there and citizens to say this is something that we want. And I think the point that Ben just made, there's nothing to lose. This is not going to be something that will oblige them, that will then change the entire structure. That's going to be, it will be groundbreaking from the citizens' point of view, but on the side of the member states, it's not, they don't have much to lose. So I think that if we just, we have a hook like this, we say this can only bring us further as far as bringing citizens closer to the UN and bringing more trust into the UN, especially in times when the world has to come together in pandemics, for example, and issues like climate change. I think we can say that there's only benefits for a tool like this to exist.
Great, thank you very much, all of you. I believe we have a question from Jeffrey. He wrote it in the chat box, but you can go ahead and ask it.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm Jeffrey Huffines. I'm Senior Advisor for what was UN 2020, now the Coalition for the UN That We Need. And in fact, I mean, I think as many people know on this call, UN 2020 last year, we were delighted to endorse the idea of a World Citizens Initiative in our UN 75 People's Declaration. So we'll put that in the chat. I hope everyone has a chance to read it. So as my question states, and it's in line with the conversation we're now having, and that is, rather than waiting for the United Nations to endorse this concept, couldn't we, as a first step, establish a WCI organizing committee independent of the UN that would solicit the petitions, that would develop the modalities to do so, to demonstrate its efficacy, and then could identify a group of member states who would agree to carry the petition forward through the UN, either as a GA resolution or a GA high-level debate. So in so doing, we would circumvent this idea that we need to somehow get the UN's approval to make this idea happen. I might add also that the Coalition for the UN We Need, we're very interested in developing multilateral innovation hubs. So maybe this is one idea for such an initiative.
Sounds like an interesting idea to me. And just on the EU learning point, it reminds me of the TTIP unofficial ECI. They stepped out, they used the established procedure that was there, and then they weren't allowed to register their proposal, and they said, well, okay, but we're going to go and do it anyway. So they collected several million signatures from across the member states, followed all the rules, and presented it, and had an influence on policy making. So yeah, that's an interesting idea to show it works, and through that to try and make the change, using a framework that we can establish and agree on. Good idea.
Right. Yeah, I particularly like that idea. It sounds like a World Citizens Initiative in order to start a World Citizens Initiative. I really do like that. And I also think that there's something to say actually for the exact multi-dimensional approach that the campaign is taking. You know, in events like this, also conversations with individual member states. I think it's a fantastic idea, and it should sit alongside the multi-dimensional approach that the campaign is already taking. But again, it feels like a campaign question, so maybe there's space here for others to chip in.
Yeah, maybe that's I think that's a great idea. We should we should definitely talk about it. Yeah, I think we have well, we have actually Andreas Bummel who wants to ask a question. So maybe you could also comment on that first. So who's from our partner organization, Democracy Without Borders.
Well, I also think that's very interesting. So some member state or a group of member states could volunteer, put forward resolutions based on some system that is WCI similar. That's very interesting. But I was raising my hand because I wanted to pose a question concerning this other item on how to get it implemented. And it's true, we would need approval of the General Assembly, but this reminded me that in the study that you authored, James and Ben, you said, and we discussed it at the time, but you say that there should be a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly. And I just wanted to get back to that and ask, isn't that really a threshold that is too high? Again, ask it again now after 1 year. Might it not be sufficient if there's just a simple majority vote in the General Assembly? 2/3 is just really very high.
So I remember our discussions at the time, Andreas, and I think they were really important discussions to have. To my knowledge, that there is nothing in terms of the practice of the General Assembly that would in any way suggest that this would have to meet the requirement for what's known as an important question, which would therefore require the 2/3 majority. We fell on that side of the hurdle because we were departing from the premise that an initiative that had at its heart democratic principles should be born from the highest degree of democratic legitimacy that was possible. But it may well be actually that when we move to the implementation stage, that is an unnecessarily high threshold to meet. And so I would quite sort of comfortably suggest that it's not a hurdle that would have to be technically met. I absolutely would agree with Andreas on that point, yeah.
So James, no more comments on this?
No,
Great.
I'll leave that to Ben.
Great. Then I think, seeing as we're a little bit over time already, we are going to close off this webinar here. I would really like to thank the both of you, James and Ben, for these really interesting inputs, and to all of you who joined for your great questions and your support. And it's really really great to see that that this idea makes people enthusiastic, and it makes people think of what we can do with it and ways we can get it implemented. And so I would really like to invite all of you also to stay connected with us and with the campaign. So we're posting the website again in the chat box. So please do sign up for our for news from us, and write us, and sign up for the campaign. We look forward to working with all of you in the future on this, because obviously we cannot do this alone. We need as many people as we can get to get to a World Citizens Initiative. So thank you all for joining, and have a nice evening.